Watch as Senator John Kennedy delivers the most devastating political destruction to Jamie Raskin using nothing but a battered briefcase. What you are about to hear is the most devastating political destruction since the founding of the Republic, and it was delivered by a man everybody in Washington thought was too dumb to tie his own shoelaces. When Harvard law professor Jamie Raskin called Senator John Kennedy an ignorant Southern relic on live television, he had no idea he was picking a fight with a fellow Harvard law graduate who'd have spent 4 weeks building the nuclear bomb, sitting inside a battered leather briefcase. Hit that like button right now, because in the next 45 minutes, you're going to watch a simple country lawyer from Louisiana dismantle a constitutional law professor using the professor's own wife's financial records. And when Kennedy reveals the one thing Raskin has been hiding about the 2016 election, even Democrats will be calling for his resignation. Subscribe and buckle up. This country lawyer is about to teach a law professor the lesson of his life. Jamie Raskin's left hand was gripping a pocket Constitution so tightly that the leather binding was creasing. But the Constitution couldn't help him now, because the man across the room was using it against him, chapter and verse, with a Louisiana accent that made every devastating citation sound like a bedtime story. The constitutional law professor, who had spent 25 years teaching Harvard-educated lawyers how to argue, had not spoken a single word in 11 minutes, the longest silence of his professional life. Because every time he opened his mouth, the country lawyer from Shreveport pulled another folder from that beaten-up briefcase and gently, politely, with a bless-your-heart smile that could curdle milk at 40 paces, made everything worse. But to understand how America's most celebrated constitutional scholar was reduced to sitting mute while a man who talked like Foghorn Leghorn systematically dismantled his career, you have to go back 43 minutes to the moment Raskin made the worst mistake a Harvard man can make. He assumed he was the only one in the room who'd gone there. The joint hearing room in the Dirksen Senate office building was standing room only, which was unusual for a session titled Constitutional Standards for Public Officials and almost unheard of for a Wednesday morning in Washington. The reason for the overflow crowd was not the topic. The topic was bureaucratic quicksand, the kind of subject that made C-SPAN viewers change the channel, and congressional staffers develop sudden dental emergencies requiring immediate attention. The reason the room was packed was the matchup. Representative Jamie Raskin of Maryland, constitutional law professor, Harvard law graduate, lead impeachment manager for the second impeachment of Donald Trump, and the progressive intellectual's idea of a political superhero, had agreed to participate in a joint session with the Senate Judiciary Committee. He had agreed because, according to sources who later spoke to the press, he believed it would be an opportunity to educate the American public about constitutional principles. He had agreed because he wanted to be on television. And he had agreed because the Republican questioner assigned to the hearing was Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana, a man Raskin privately described to his staff as a Fox News comedian who happens to have a Senate seat. Raskin arrived with an entourage befitting a man who believed he was the smartest person in any room he entered. 2 constitutional law professors from American University flanked him like academic bodyguards. 4 legislative aides carried matching leather portfolios. A stack of constitutional law journals, 3 of which featured Raskin's own articles, sat prominently on the witness table. His suit was impeccable. His silver hair was swept back with professorial distinction. His pocket Constitution, the one he had carried during the impeachment trial, the one that had appeared in approximately 400 photographs, protruded from his breast pocket at a carefully calibrated angle. Senator John Kennedy arrived alone. He carried one item, a leather briefcase, so old and battered that it looked like it had been dragged behind a pickup truck down a gravel road in Tangipahoa Parish. The leather was scuffed, One of the clasps was held together with what appeared to be electrical tape. The handle had been restitched by hand, and not recently. It was the kind of briefcase that a first-year public defender might carry, if the first-year public defender had inherited it from his grandfather, who had inherited it from his grandfather, who had used it to carry catfish home from the market. Kennedy's suit was decent, but unremarkable. His white hair was slightly mussed, as if he de-rolled down the car window on the drive over and hadn't bothered to fix it. His wire-rimmed glasses were smudged. He shuffled to his seat behind the Senate dais, with the unhurried gait of a man who had nowhere particular to be, and nothing particular to prove. The cameras loved the contrast. On one side, the progressive intellectual surrounded by experts, armed with journals, radiating confidence and credentials. On the other, the rumpled Southerner with the old briefcase, looking like he'd dove or wandered in from a fishing trip and wasn't entirely sure he was in the right building. The chairman gavelled the hearing to order, and Jamie Raskin immediately seized the floor. He did not wait to be recognized. He did not wait for the procedural formalities. He stood up, adjusted his pocket constitution, and addressed the room as if he were delivering a lecture to first-year law students who had not done the reading. Before we begin, I want to establish something for the record. He turned to face Kennedy directly. I am a constitutional law professor. I have taught at American University Washington College of Law for 25 years. I graduated from Harvard Law School magna cum laude. I have published 3 books on constitutional theory, contributed to 14 law review articles, and clerked for a federal judge. I was elected to the Maryland State Senate, where I chaired the Ethics Reform Committee, and I was chosen by my colleagues to lead the impeachment proceedings against a sitting president of the United States, the most consequential constitutional undertaking of our generation. He paused to let the resume settle over the room like a silk blanket. You, Senator Kennedy, are a man who has become famous for folksy one-liners on cable news. His voice carried the particular condescension of an academic who believes that cleverness and intelligence are opposing forces. You compare government agencies to a dumpster fire in a train wreck. You describe legislation as a turd in a punch bowl. Very entertaining, great television, wonderful material for social media clips. He stepped closer to the microphone. But this is a constitutional hearing. Senator, not a comedy show, not a crawfish boil, not whatever passes for intellectual discourse in Shreveport, Louisiana, so I would respectfully ask, and I do mean respectfully, that you leave the folksy humor at the door and engage with the actual constitutional questions before this committee. He sat down and delivered the final line with the timing of a man who had rehearsed it in his bathroom mirror. If you re capable of that. Scattered applause from the progressive gallery. 2 of Raskin's American University colleagues nodded vigorously. A CNN legal analyst in the press section was already typing the phrase, Raskin School's Southern Senator, into a draft headline. Senator John Kennedy listened to all of it, with an expression of mild, almost bovine interest, the face of a man watching a neighbor's dog chase its own tail. When Raskin finished, Kennedy did not respond immediately. He scratched the back of his neck. He removed his glasses, squinted at them, as if noticing for the first time that they were smudged, and cleaned them slowly with a handkerchief that had seen better days. He put them back on. He adjusted his microphone. He looked at the ceiling, then at the floor, then at the briefcase beside him. 20 seconds passed. The room grew restless. Raskin's smirk deepened. Several reporters exchanged glances. Was Kennedy going to say anything? Was the senator from Louisiana simply outmatched? Then Kennedy leaned into the microphone, and his Louisiana drawl, thick and slow and sweet as cane syrup poured on a January morning, filled the room. Well, golly, Professor Raskin, that's mighty impressive. Harvard Law, 25 years teaching. 3 books, I don't think I've written 3 letters in the last 25 years, unless you count the one I sent to the Sears catalog people about a lawnmower that didn't work. Light laughter. Raskin's expression tightened slightly. This was the Kennedy he'd expected. The comedian, the entertainer, the man who would rather make a joke than make a point. And you're right, Kennedy continued. I am just a country lawyer from Shreveport, went to some little school or another. Cannot quite recall the name right now. My memory is not what it used to be. Meemaw always said I'd lose my own head if it wasn't attached to my neck. More laughter. Raskin relaxed. This was going exactly as planned. The country bumpkin was doing his country bumpkin routine, and the cameras were capturing every folksy syllable. But my daddy taught me something growing up, Kennedy said, and something in his voice shifted just slightly, just enough that 3 people in the front row noticed. He said, "Son, when a man spends the first 5 minutes of a conversation telling you how smart he is, he's about to do something real dumb." The laughter stopped. So with all due respect, Professor, and I do mean all due respect, let's see your homework? Kennedy reached down and placed the battered briefcase on the desk. The clasps, including the one held together with electrical tape, opened with a sound like 2 small gunshots. Inside, arranged with a precision that contradicted everything about the briefcase's exterior, were folders. 6 of them, each one labeled by hand in neat blue ink, the handwriting of a man who had learned penmanship from nuns at a Catholic school in Shreveport and never saw a reason to change. I may not be a professor, sir, but I am a lawyer, and lawyers don't give lectures. He opened the first folder. We present evidence. He looked up at Raskin with a smile that had about as much warmth as a January morning in Baton Rouge. Let's start with your wife, Professor. Sarah Bloom Raskin, former Federal Reserve Governor, former Deputy Treasury Secretary, very accomplished woman, and a very interesting stock portfolio that you somehow forgot to tell Congress about for 8 months. The color began its slow retreat from Jamie Raskin's face. Kennedy had not even started, and the room already knew the possum was done playing dead. Kennedy opened the first folder and laid its contents on the desk with the care of a man setting a table for company, which, in a sense, he was. The company was the American public. The meal was Jamie Raskin's career. Now, Professor, Kennedy began, you teach constitutional law. You lecture about transparency. You write books about holding public officials accountable. You've built your entire brand. And it is a brand, sir, make no mistake, on the idea that elected officials should be honest with the American people about their financial interests. He pulled out a single sheet of paper and held it up. Though the text was too small for anyone beyond the first row to read, that didn't matter. What mattered was the gesture. The lawyer presenting Exhibit A, your wife, Sarah Bloom Raskin, and I want to be respectful because by all accounts she's a talented and accomplished woman. She served on the Federal Reserve Board of Governors from 2010 to 2014. Then she was Deputy Secretary of the Treasury. Those are among the highest financial regulatory positions in the United States government. She had access to every central banking contact, every regulatory insider, every financial institution relationship that exists in the federal system. In 2017, after leaving government, she joined the board of a company called Reserve Trust, a fintech company based in Colorado. A small operation, not a household name, but they had big ambitions, and one of those ambitions was getting a master account at the Federal Reserve. He looked at the committee. For those watching at home, a Fed master account is like a VIP pass to the American banking system. It lets you transfer money directly through the Federal Reserve, bypassing regular banks. It's extremely valuable, and it's extremely hard to get. He turned back to Raskin. Reserve Trust applied for this master account, and they were denied. The Kansas City Fed turned them down. said they didn't qualify. Application rejected. Case closed. He paused, cleaned his glasses again, put them back on. Except it wasn't closed, because your wife picked up the phone and she called the Kansas City Fed. Her old colleagues, the people she used to supervise. The people who had reported to her when she was a governor on the board. And wouldn't you know it, Reserve Trust reapplied. And this time, magically, miraculously, against all odds, and against the initial determination of the Fed's own staff, they were approved. He looked up. Now I'm just a simple country lawyer from Shreveport. But where I come from, when a former regulator calls her old agency to get special treatment for a company that's paying her, we don't call that networking. We don't call that leveraging expertise. We call it what it is, a conflict of interest. And my Meemaw, God rest her soul, she had a simpler word for it. She called it fixing. But that's not the part that bothers me most. Kennedy pulled out another document. What bothers me is what happened next. Your wife received 195,936 shares of Reserve Trust stock as compensation for her board service. In December 2020, she sold those shares. The proceeds approximately $1.5 million. He set the document down and looked at Raskin the way a father looks at a teenager who just wrecked the family car and is trying to blame the mailbox. Federal law, specifically the Stock Act and 5 U.S.C. Appendix Section 102, requires members of Congress to disclose financial transactions of this nature within 45 days. 45 days. That's about 6 weeks. Time enough to fill out a form, walk it down the hall, and hand it to the clerk. Not complicated. I've seen kindergartners handle more complex paperwork. You filed your disclosure in August 2021, 8 months after the transaction. Not 45 days. Not 90 days. 8 months. He removed his glasses, held them up to the light, and squinted through them as if checking for clarity. A gesture that somehow managed to suggest he was also checking Raskin's story for clarity and finding it equally smudged. My Meemaw used to say, if a man forgets to mention $1, that's an accident. If he forgets to mention $1.5 million, that's a business decision. She was a wise woman. My Meemaw smelled like cigarettes and common sense. Raskin leaned forward, his voice carrying the sharp edge of a man accustomed to winning arguments by volume and velocity. Senator, this is a fundamentally dishonest characterization. The disclosure was filed late due to an administrative error in my office. The House Ethics Committee reviewed the matter and took no action. No action. This is a manufactured scandal promoted by right-wing opposition research groups with a clear partisan agenda. An administrative error, Kennedy repeated, nodding slowly, as if trying the words on for size, and finding they didn't fit. $1.5 million. And you, a man who teaches law, who writes about transparency, who stood before the United States Senate during impeachment proceedings and lectured the nation about presidential ethics and the sacred obligations of public office. You forgot about $1.5 million for 8 months. He held up a hand. Look, I lose things. I do. I've lost my reading glasses more times than I've had hot dinners. I once forgot where I parked my truck at the Piggly Wiggly and walked around the parking lot for 20 minutes before I remembered I'd taken my wife's car. So I understand forgetfulness. He leaned forward. But I have never forgotten about $1.5 million, and I don't believe you did either, Professor, because that's not an error. That's a decision to keep quiet and hope nobody noticed. Kennedy looked toward the gallery. There's a woman here today who noticed, Mrs. Helen Kowalski, from Bethesda, Maryland. Professor Raskin, S. District. Mrs. Kowalski, would you mind standing for a moment? An elderly woman in the seventh row stood slowly. She was 71, with white hair and a cardigan that had been buttoned carefully against the hearing room's aggressive air conditioning. She held a small piece of paper in her hands, a printed receipt. Mrs. Kowalski donated $50 to Professor Raskin's campaign in 2020, Kennedy said. $50 from her Social Security check, because she believed, in her words, that he was fighting corruption in Washington. He read from a sworn statement. I donated $50 because Congressman Raskin said he stood for transparency and accountability. Now I find out his wife made $1.5 million from a company she helped get special government access, and he hid it for 8 months. I'm a retired school teacher living on Social Security. $50 is a lot of money to me. I feel used. Mrs. Kowalski sat down. She was still holding the receipt. She won't get her $50 back, Kennedy said quietly, but she deserved to know the truth about where her trust went. And now she does. He closed the first folder and placed his hand on the second. But the reserve trust situation is just the appetizer, Professor. My Meemaw used to say, the main course is always bigger than the breadbasket. And this main course, well, this one involves something you did in January 2017 that is going to be very, very difficult to explain, especially for a man who impeached a president for doing the exact same thing 4 years later. Now, if you're still listening, you already know this country lawyer isn't done, not even close. What comes next is going to make everything you've heard so far look like a warm-up. Hit that like button right now, because this country lawyer is about to expose the biggest hypocrisy in modern political history. Comment bless your heart if you see the trap Kennedy just set. Let's continue. Kennedy opened the second folder. The label, handwritten in the same neat blue ink, read January 6th, 2017. Not 2021. 2017. Professor Raskin, you are best known in American politics for one thing: leading the second impeachment of President Donald Trump. The charge was incitement of insurrection. The theory was that Trump's questioning of the 2020 election results was so dangerous, so unprecedented, so corrosive to the foundations of American democracy that it warranted the most extreme constitutional remedy available: the removal of a sitting president. He looked up from the folder. You've called it your proudest achievement. You wrote about it in your book. You've given speeches about it at universities, at fundraisers, at law conferences. You've built the second half of your career on the proposition that questioning election results is a threat to the Republic. Now let me tell you about January 6th, 2017. He pulled out a document. This is the congressional record from January 6th, 2017, the day the Electoral College results of the 2016 election were certified. On that day, you, Professor Raskin, along with several House colleagues, stood up and objected to the certification of the presidential election. You tried to block the certification of Donald Trump's 2016 victory. He read directly from the record, his drawl dropping away just enough to let the words carry their own weight. The 2016 election was badly tainted by everything from cyber-sabotage by Vladimir Putin to deliberate voter suppression by Republicans in numerous swing states. Those are your words, Professor. On the floor of the United States House of Representatives, on live television, you questioned the legitimacy of a presidential election. Kennedy set the document down with exaggerated care, as if placing a loaded weapon on a table. Now let me make sure I understand the math here. Because I went to public school in Shreveport, and sometimes the big numbers confuse me. He counted on his fingers. When you objected to election certification in 2017, that was, what did you call it? Defending democracy. When Trump questioned election results in 2021, that was insurrection. Is that the formula? Because I want to make sure I'm applying it correctly. He scratched his chin. Where I come from? We have a word for that, Professor. Starts with H, ends with Y, P-O-R-E-S-E. And in between there's a whole lot of letters that spell out different rules for me than for thee. Raskin fired back with the velocity of a man who had been waiting for this attack and had his defense loaded and ready. He stood, his voice carrying the force and precision of a 5-year career in constitutional argument. Senator Kennedy, that is a false equivalence, and you know it. His finger jabbed the air. I raised a procedural objection. It was ruled out of order in 30 seconds. 30 seconds. I didn't incite a mob. I didn't tell thousands of people to fight like hell. I didn't send them to attack the Capitol building. 5 people died on January 6, 2021. Police officers were beaten with flagpoles. The difference between my procedural objection and what Trump did is the difference between a parking ticket and an armed robbery. The progressive gallery applauded. Several Democrats on the committee nodded vigorously. Raskin's constitutional law colleagues were on their feet for 15 full seconds. The hearing room belonged to Jamie Raskin. He was in his element. The professor correcting a student's flawed analysis. The prosecutor dismantling a defense attorney's faulty premise. His voice shook with genuine conviction. Kennedy waited. He waited until the applause died, until the professors sat down, until the room settled back into the particular silence that precedes a verdict. "You rewrite that people died on January 6th, Kennedy said. His voice was quieter now. That was a terrible day. A dark day. I'm not comparing the events, Professor. I'm not comparing a riot to a procedural objection. I'm comparing the principle." He held up the congressional record. "You said, your words, your mouth, your microphone, that the 2016 election was tainted. You used the floor of the United States House of Representatives to question the legitimacy of a presidential election. You used your platform, your authority, your credentials to suggest that the duly elected president was illegitimate. And then 4 years later, you told America that anyone who questions election results is an existential danger to democracy. You said it so forcefully, so convincingly, that you impeached a president for it." He held up both hands, palms up, as if weighing 2 objects. "Which is it, Professor? Either questioning elections is legitimate political discourse, in which case Donald Trump had the same right you exercised, or it's a mortal threat to the Republic, in which case you committed the same offense in 2017 that you impeached Trump for in 2021. You can have it both ways. Even at Harvard, and I know because I checked, even at Harvard, 2 + 2 still equals 4. He leaned back and let the logic do its work. It was a simple argument, deceptively simple, which was the point. Constitutional scholars could write 1, 2-page rebuttals, full of distinctions and nuances and footnotes. But the American people watching at home didn't read 1, 2-page rebuttals. They understood a man saying one thing and doing another. They understood hypocrisy. And Kennedy had just wrapped it in a package so clean and simple that no amount of academic distinction drawing could unwrap it. "You know," Kennedy continued, and the drawl was back now, warm and slow. "My cousin Thibodeau, good man, heart of gold, not the brightest bulb in the chandelier. He once bet on both teams in the LSU-Alabama game, said he couldn't lose. You know what happened? He lost twice. Because you can't put money on both sides of the same argument and expect to come out ahead." He pointed at Raskin. "You bet on election objections are patriotic in 2017. and you bet on election objections are insurrection in 2021. And the American people, Professor, are starting to notice that you lost both bets, just like Thibodeau. But we're just getting warmed up, Kennedy said, reaching for the third folder, because the election hypocrisy connects to something bigger, your crowning achievement, your magnum opus, the thing you've dined out on for 4 years, your impeachment case against President Trump. He opened the folder and spread its contents across the desk, because when you look at that case with a lawyer's eye, Professor, instead of a Professor S agenda, it has got more holes in it than my fishing net after a gator got hold of it. And I should know, I've lost 3 nets to gators. Those nets held up better than your case. Kennedy arranged 3 documents on the desk before him, side by side, like cards in a hand of poker, which in a sense they were. And Kennedy had been counting cards for 4 weeks. You were the lead impeachment manager for the second impeachment of Donald Trump, you called it. And I wrote this down because I thought it was beautiful. The most bipartisan impeachment in American history. You've been dining out on it ever since. Speeches, book deals, television appearances. The impeachment of Donald Trump is the centerpiece of your political identity. But I'm a lawyer, Professor, not a professor. A lawyer. And lawyers look at cases, not press conferences. We look at evidence, not speeches. And when I look at your impeachment case, the way a trial lawyer examines evidence before a jury, the way I examined evidence for 20 years in courtrooms across Louisiana, I see problems. He pulled out the first document. You presented video evidence of the January 6th events to the United States Senate. Powerful footage, emotional, disturbing. You edited that footage into a presentation that was, I'll admit, very effective television, very compelling cinema. He paused. But you edited it, Professor. You showed the violence. You showed the chaos. You showed the fear. And you did not show the portions of President Trump's speech where he said, and I have the full transcript right here. Official White House stenographer's record. I know that everyone here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard. He held up the transcript and underlined the words with his finger, peacefully and patriotically, 6 syllables that you cut from your presentation. You took a speech, removed the exculpatory language, and presented the remainder to the Senate as evidence of incitement. His voice hardened just 1 degree, just enough to signal the shift from folksy commentary to legal analysis in a criminal trial. Professor, in the courtrooms where I spent 20 years, where evidence has to meet actual standards, a prosecutor who deliberately omits exculpatory material faces sanctions, potentially disbarment, potentially criminal charges for prosecutorial misconduct. You did the same thing in front of the United States Senate and called it the trial of the century. He pulled out the second document. But the edited video wasn't the only problem with your evidence. Your team also presented a social media post that turned out to be altered. A blue verification checkmark had been digitally added to make an unverified account appear to be an official source. When your team was caught, they called it an error. Kennedy removed his glasses, cleaned them, put them back on. The ritual had become a metronome, a ticking clock that everyone in the room was beginning to associate with incoming devastation. Professor Raskin, in the courtrooms where I practiced law, and I practiced in courtrooms, not lecture halls, fabricating evidence is not called an error. It's called fraud. It's grounds for a mistrial. It's grounds for sanctions. It's grounds for a referral to the Bar Association. And if you did it in a criminal case in Louisiana or Maryland or any state, you would be facing disciplinary proceedings. Then Kennedy did something he had not done in the hearing. He dropped the drawl, not gradually, not partially. He dropped it the way a man drops a mask, completely, instantly. revealing something underneath that was sharper, faster, and considerably more dangerous. Let me be precise about this. His voice was different, clipped, rapid. The voice of a man who had argued before federal appellate courts and won. The foghorn leghorn cadence was gone. In its place was something that sounded like it belonged in the Supreme Court building across the street. The standard for impeachment under Article 2, Section 4 of the Constitution is high crimes and misdemeanors. You built your case on selectively edited video, a manipulated timeline, and an altered social media post. In any Article 3 courtroom in the United States, state or federal, trial or appellate, that evidentiary record would not survive a motion for summary judgment. You would have been sanctioned under Rule 11 of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure for presenting claims unsupported by existing law and lacking evidentiary support. And if you were a district attorney who pulled these tactics in a criminal prosecution, you would be under investigation by the state bar before the jury reached the parking lot. The drawl returned, soft and warm like a blanket being pulled over a sleeping child. But you weren't in a courtroom, were you, Professor? You were in the Senate, where the rules of evidence don't apply, where you could edit video and nobody objects, where you could present altered social media posts and call it an error, where a law professor gets to play prosecutor without following any of the rules that real prosecutors have to follow. My Meemaw had a saying for that. A man who wins a fight where he wrote the rules didn't win a fight. He staged a play. Raskin pushed back. 57 senators voted to convict. The most bipartisan impeachment vote in American history. 7 Republicans voted with us, and 43 voted to acquit, Kennedy said gently. In real court, Professor, that is called an acquittal. Not a moral victory, not a historic bipartisan moment. An acquittal. You needed 67, you got 57. In baseball, that is a swing and a miss. In law, that is a case you lost. Kennedy paused. The folksy warmth left his eyes for a moment, replaced by something quieter and more human. Professor Raskin, I want to say something, and I want you to hear it the way I mean it. I know you lost your son, Tommy, in December 2020. I know he was 25 years old. I know the Capitol attack happened days later, and you built the impeachment case while you were still grieving. I cannot imagine that pain. I won't pretend to, and I would never use a man's grief against him. But grief does not entitle you to cut corners with the Constitution you swore to defend. The Constitution doesn't have a grief exception. It doesn't have a footnote that says standards of evidence may be relaxed during periods of personal hardship. And a man who has spent 25 years teaching constitutional law should know that better than anyone else in this building. The room was very quiet. Even Raskin supporters in the gallery had nothing to say to that, because Kennedy had done something rare in Washington. He had acknowledged his opponent's humanity without surrendering his argument. He had shown compassion, and then, with surgical precision, demonstrated that compassion and accountability are not mutually exclusive. Kennedy closed the third folder, but the impeachment and the election hypocrisy, those are symptoms, Professor. The disease runs deeper. Because you have built an entire career on something that Harvard Law School, our law school, should have taught you never to do. He reached for the fourth folder. You've confused being loud with being right. And on that subject, I have one more presentation. And it's my favorite, because it ends with a question you cannot answer. What happens in this next chapter is going to change how you see Jamie Raskin forever. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time, because this country lawyer is about to deliver the kill shot. And it starts with one word that Jamie Raskin said 22 years ago that is about to come back and end him. Kennedy reached into the briefcase one final time and produced not a folder, but a single sheet of paper. It was creased, as if it had been folded and unfolded many times. He held it up. Professor Raskin, before I ask my final question, I want to address something you said at the beginning of this hearing. You listed your credentials: Harvard Law School, 25 years teaching, 3 books, a clerkship. You told me to leave the folksy humor at the door, but because I wasn't qualified for constitutional discourse. He set the creased paper down and reached deeper into the briefcase. What he produced was old, genuinely old. A diploma, slightly yellowed, in a simple frame that had been wrapped in a cloth to protect it during transport. He held it up. Harvard Law School, class of 1977. Juris Doctor, magna cum laude. He turned it toward the cameras. That's my name right there. John Neely Kennedy. The hearing room made a sound, not a gasp. Something deeper. A collective intake of breath from 300 people, simultaneously recalibrating everything they thought they knew about the man holding the diploma. Raskin's face underwent a transformation that the C-SPAN cameras captured in high definition, and that would be replayed approximately 22 million times in the following 48 hours. It was not shock, exactly. It was the expression of a man who has just discovered that the mouse he's been playing with is a cat. I also went to Vanderbilt for my undergraduate degree, Kennedy continued, almost apologetically, and I spent a year at Oxford. The one in England, not the one in Mississippi, studying constitutional history. But I don't like to lead with my diplomas, Professor, because my Meemaw taught me something that Harvard never covered in the curriculum. He placed the diploma back in the briefcase with the same care he'd used to extract it. She said, "Son, never trust a man who tells you where he went to school before he tells you what he knows. His work should speak for itself." He patted the battered briefcase. Turns out this old thing went to Harvard too. It just doesn't brag about it. The laughter that erupted was not the polite, restrained laughter of a congressional hearing. It was the full-throated, tension-breaking laughter of an audience that has been holding its breath for an hour and has finally been given permission to exhale. Republicans laughed. Democrats tried not to laugh and failed. Even one of Raskin's American University colleagues, the one on the left, was seen covering her mouth with her hand, her shoulders shaking. Kennedy let it subside. Then his face changed. "Now let's talk about something you said when you first ran for Congress." He picked up the creased paper, the one he'd unfolded many times. "In 2015, when you announced your campaign, you gave a statement to the press, and you said something that I wrote down because I thought it was genuinely beautiful." He read, "My ambition is not to be in the political center. It is to be in the moral center." He set the paper down. The moral center. What a magnificent phrase. I mean that sincerely, Professor. If I had written that, I'd be proud of it. It's the kind of sentence that makes you want to vote for whoever said it. But let's test it against the evidence, shall we? Because that's what lawyers do. We take beautiful phrases and we check them against the facts. And the facts, Professor, are not beautiful. He raised one finger at a time, counting. A man in the moral center does not hide $1.5 million from Congress for 8 months. Second finger. A man in the moral center does not object to election results when he loses and call it insurrection when the other side does it. Third finger. A man in the moral center does not edit video evidence and present altered social media posts in an impeachment trial. Fourth finger. A man in the moral center does not let his wife use government connections to secure preferential treatment for a company that paid her in stock. Fifth finger. And a man in the moral center does not live in one of the wealthiest counties in America, Montgomery County, median household income $137,000, while lecturing working families about sacrifice and telling coal miners their jobs have to disappear for the climate. He lowered his hand. Professor Raskin, that is not the moral center. That's not even the moral suburbs. That's the moral wilderness. And you've been living out there for years, completely lost, while lecturing the rest of us about the neighborhood. Kennedy stood up. It was the first time in the hearing that he had risen from his chair, and the effect was immediate. The room compressed, focused, drew inward toward the standing figure of the country lawyer who was no longer sitting behind a desk, but occupying the full space of the moment. I have one question for you, Professor. One question, and I want a yes or no answer. The room held its breath. Raskin gripped the edge of his table. His pocket Constitution was still there, protruding from his breast pocket, but it looked different now, less like a symbol of authority and more like a prop in a costume he'd been wearing too long. In January 2017, you stood on the floor of the House of Representatives and objected to the certification of the presidential election. You called it tainted. You questioned its legitimacy. You used the word sabotage. You suggested the incoming president's victory was illegitimate. In January 2021, you led the impeachment of a president for, in your words, inciting insurrection. By questioning the certification of the presidential election, you argued that questioning election results was so dangerous that it warranted removal from office. So my question is simple, Professor. Was it wrong to object to election certification? Or was it right? Silence. Absolute. Crushing. Hearing room silence. The kind of silence that has its own sound. A high, thin ringing, like the aftermath of an explosion. Because if it was wrong, if objecting to election certification is the threat to democracy you said it was, then you owe this House an apology for doing it in 2017. You owe the American people an apology for undermining democracy 4 years before you claimed to be defending it. And if it was right, if election objections are legitimate democratic discourse, then you owe Donald Trump an apology for impeaching him for doing what you yourself did. Which is it, Professor? Kennedy waited. 5 seconds. 7. 10. Take your time, he said softly. I know it's a hard question, even for a Harvard man. Raskin opened his mouth, closed it. His left hand, the one that had been gripping the pocket Constitution, released it. The little leather book slipped back into his pocket, and he did not retrieve it. 12 seconds. 14. The silence was becoming its own kind of testimony, louder than any answer could have been. Finally, Raskin said, "The situations are fundamentally diff. Yes or no, Professor?" Kennedy's voice was gentle but immovable. Was it wrong or was it right? 4 more seconds. The longest 4 seconds in the hearing room's history. Raskin said nothing. Kennedy nodded once. I thought so. He sat back down. The drawl returned, warm and slow, wrapping around 2 words that fell like a velvet guillotine. Bless your heart. Jamie Raskin made one last attempt. He rose from his chair, and his voice, hoarse now, stripped of its professorial authority, carried the desperation of a man reaching for a lifeline that has already been cut. This is a partisan attack. This is exactly what the founders warned about. The weaponization of congressional proceedings to settle political scores. The founders, Kennedy said, and his voice was gentle in the way that a doctor's voice is gentle when delivering difficult news, also warned about something else. Professor, they warned about men who wrap themselves in the Constitution while violating its principles. Men who claim to be guardians of democracy while applying its standards selectively. Men who use the language of the law to hide from its consequences. He closed the battered briefcase. Both clasps, including the one with the electrical tape, snapped shut with a sound that seemed louder than it should have been. You've spent your career telling America that you are the Constitution's greatest defender. But defenders don't hide $1.5 million. Defenders don't edit evidence. Defenders don't apply different standards to themselves than they apply to everyone else. My daddy was a firefighter in Shreveport, worked Engine Company 12. When I was 12 years old, there was an explosion at a facility he was responding to. He was burned bad. 2nd degree, 3rd degree burns. He spent months in the hospital. He was permanently disabled, could never work again, but he taught me something before that happened. He taught me something that 20 years of law practice, Oxford, Harvard, none of it could improve on. He said, "Son, integrity isn't what you do when people are watching. Integrity is what you do when you think nobody's looking. You thought nobody was looking when you hid that 1.5 million, Professor. You thought nobody was looking when you edited that video. You thought nobody was looking when your wife called the Kansas City Fed. But somebody was looking. A country lawyer from Louisiana with a beat-up briefcase and too much time on his hands." He gestured to the room, to the cameras, to the millions watching at home. "And now, everybody's looking." The committee chairman gavelled. "Based on the evidence and testimony presented, this committee will refer the financial disclosure questions to the Office of Congressional Ethics for formal investigation. The committee will also request that the Department of Justice review the Reserve Trust Master Account matter for potential conflicts of interest. The committee will additionally enter into the record Senator Kennedy's analysis of the evidentiary standards used in the second impeachment trial for review by the House Rules Committee." Raskin's lawyers were on their feet, speaking simultaneously. The chairman gavelled again. "The referrals are ordered." The progressive gallery was emptying. 2 of Raskin's American University colleagues had already left, taking their constitutional law journals with them. His communications director was on his phone in the hallway, presumably drafting a statement that would include the phrases "partisan witch hunt" and "attack on democratic norms," and would change absolutely nothing. Raskin stood. He straightened his jacket. He touched the pocket Constitution in his breast pocket, a gesture that had once looked like devotion and now looked like habit. He walked toward the exit without looking at Kennedy, without looking at the committee, without looking at Mrs. Kowalski in the 7th row, who was still holding her $50 receipt. At the door, he turned, his mouth open to say something final, something defiant, something that could be clipped and tweeted and used to frame the narrative. Kennedy was already closing the briefcase. The electrical tape clasp gave him trouble, as it apparently always did. He fussed with it, not looking up, and said almost to himself, but loudly enough for the microphone to carry, "Professor, my meemaw used to say, you can't unring a bell. The bell's been rung. Go home." Raskin left without another word. The door closed behind him with a sound that was somehow quieter than a 3-inch briefcase clasp, and louder than anything that had been said in the previous hour. The aftermath arrived in layers, the way weather moves across Louisiana. First the wind, then the rain, then the thing you were actually worried about. The first layer was digital. Within 30 minutes, 3 hashtags occupied the top of every trending list. Country Lawyer Constitution at number 1, Bless Your Heart at number 2, and Moral Wilderness, a phrase Kennedy had coined and the internet had immediately adopted, at number 3. The clip of Kennedy producing his Harvard diploma was viewed 41 million times before midnight. The 8-second clip of Raskin's silence after the yes or no question was viewed even more. The second layer was institutional. Harvard Law School, which typically avoided commenting on the political activities of its graduates, issued a statement that managed to be both supportive of its alumni and completely unhelpful to either party. Harvard Law School is proud of all its graduates and their contributions to public discourse. Legal scholars across the political spectrum published analyses of Kennedy's evidentiary arguments. A former federal prosecutor writing in Lawfare called the cross-examination the most effective use of impeachment precedent analysis in congressional history. A liberal constitutional scholar at Yale grudgingly admitted that Kennedy's yes or no question was logically irrefutable, which is precisely what makes it so dangerous to the progressive position. The third layer was personal. Mrs. Helen Kowalski, the retired schoolteacher from Bethesda, gave one interview to a reporter from the Montgomery County Sentinel, her local paper. "I don't care about politics," she said. "I care about honesty. I gave that man $50 because he said he was fighting corruption. Turns out the corruption was in his own house. I just wanted someone to ask the question." The senator from Louisiana asked it. Jamie Raskin's office released a statement at 4:17 p.m. that read in part, "Today's hearing was a partisan exercise designed to distract from the real constitutional crisis facing our nation." The statement was 12 sentences long and did not address a single piece of evidence Kennedy had presented. It did not mention reserve trust. It did not mention the $1.5 million disclosure delay. It did not mention the 2017 election objection. It did not mention Harvard. Democratic colleagues were conspicuously silent. No progressive organization issued a defense. No constitutional law professor from American University published a rebuttal. The apparatus that had elevated Raskin to intellectual celebrity, the podcasts, the cable news bookers, the law review editors, went quiet with the disciplined synchronization of an institution protecting itself from a collapsing asset. That evening, Senator John Kennedy declined every interview request, and there were many. He left the Capitol through a side entrance, drove to Reagan National Airport, and boarded a flight to Shreveport that departed at 6:45 p.m. and arrived at 8:20 Central Time. From the Shreveport Airport, he drove northeast on I-20 for 37 minutes, then turned off onto a parish road that didn't have a name, only a number. The road ended at a gravel lot beside a bayou, and in the gravel lot sat a cinder block building with a tin roof, a hand-painted sign that read Beauregard's Bait and Tackle Live Crickets, Cold Beer, Good Advice, and a single bare bulb illuminating the front porch. Uncle Beauregard was sitting on an overturned bait cooler, mending a cast net by the light of that bulb. He was 79 years old, brown as a pecan shell, and had the unhurried demeanor of a man who had been sitting on that cooler since the Eisenhower administration and planned to continue sitting on it until someone gave him a good reason to stop. He looked up as Kennedy's headlights swept across the lot. He did not stand. He did not wave. He squinted at the car, identified it, and returned to his net. Kennedy got out, walked to the porch, and sat down on the steps. For a minute, neither man spoke. The bayou made its night sounds: frogs, insects, the occasional splash of something moving through the water. "Saw you on the television," Beauregard said, without looking up from his mending. That professor looked like he swallowed a catfish sideways. "He's a smart man, Uncle Beau. Smarter than me, probably." Beauregard's hands paused on the net. He gave Kennedy a look that communicated without words that this statement was incorrect, and that correcting it was beneath his dignity. "Smart and wise ain't the same thing, John. Smart is knowing the Constitution word for word. Wise is living it. That professor can recite every amendment frontwards and backwards, but he doesn't understand a single one, because understanding isn't a head thing, it's a heart thing, and his heart has been in his wallet for too long." Kennedy picked up a loose piece of monofilament from the porch and began twisting it between his fingers. "I almost felt bad for him, Uncle Beau. At the end, when he couldn't answer the question, he looked like a man who just realized the floor was gone. Almost is the right word, Beauregard said, resuming his mending. You feel bad after the truth gets told, not instead of telling it. Your Meemaw knew that. She would have liked what you did today. Kennedy smiled. Meemaw would have said, I talked too much. She would have finished him in 20 minutes. 15, Beauregard corrected. They sat in silence for a while. The bayou breathed. The bear bulb hummed. Somewhere in the dark water, a fish jumped and fell back with a sound like a small hand clapping. Uncle Beau, you think I was fair? Beauregard set down the net and looked at his nephew, the boy who had read Black S. Law Dictionary at 12, pretending it was a comic book, the young man who had gone to Harvard and Oxford and come back talking the same way he'd left, the senator who kept his diplomas in a battered briefcase instead of on a wall, because their Meemaw had taught them both that a man's worth isn't on his resume, but in his conduct. You were fair, Beauregard said. You were thorough. And you were kind, which is the part most lawyers forget. You mentioned his boy, Tommy. That took character. He picked up the net again. Now stop fishing for compliments and go home. You've got a flight in the morning, and I've got a net to fix. Kennedy stood, stretched, and walked to his car. At the door, he turned back. Meemaw's birthday would have been next week. Beauregard nodded. I know. I already bought the flowers. Kennedy got in the car. The engine started. The headlights swept across the bait shop sign. The gravel lot. The old man on the cooler. The country lawyer from Shreveport had reminded Washington of something that Harvard never taught, and Oxford never tested, that the Constitution isn't a weapon for the powerful or a prop for the ambitious. It's a shield for the people. And sometimes, the best person to hold that shield isn't the professor who wrote books about it, but the country boy who still believes in it. If you made it this far, you just heard something special. A simple country lawyer from Louisiana, who also went to Harvard but doesn't brag about it, just reminded a constitutional law professor that the Constitution belongs to the people, not to the professors who lecture about it. Not to the politicians who wave it around on cable news. To the people. Smash that like button if you believe constitutional justice was served today. Subscribe to this channel because there's more where this came from, and trust me, what's coming next will be even more devastating than what you just heard. Comment bless your heart if you think Kennedy just delivered the greatest takedown in congressional history, and share this with everyone you know who's tired of politicians who talk about the Constitution without actually following it. God bless our veterans. God bless the Constitution. And God bless the country lawyers who still fight for both. Uncle Beauregard approved this message from his bait shop while mending a net, and he says if you don't subscribe, he's raising the price of crickets.